Hi, so this is our second and final lecture on Marlene E. McKay's book, Forbidden Fruit, Engaging an Indigenous Feminist Lens as a Nehinaw Iskwew. So the objectives for this final lecture on her book are a summary. We will go over yet again what a summary is. I will summarize the book. We will talk about the book and basically how it's laid out, and then we're going to have a discussion, as much as we can in the world we are currently occupying. So as you all know, a summary is just a common writing assignment in most university courses, and it refers just to summarizing a particular piece of material. So I will be summarizing Marlene E. McKay's book, Forbidden Fruit. There are three main requirements. It should cover the original completely, it should be presented in a neutral fashion, and it should be condensed. Normally we're looking at one paragraph. So Marlene E. McKay's Forbidden Fruit, Engaging an Indigenous Feminist Lens as a Nehinaw Iskwew, 2019, is a memoir that, like its title asserts, considers McKay's primarily early life events alongside social constructions of race and gender. By examining her experiences in a northern Saskatchewan Cree community, McKay exposes patriarchal structures within the Catholic Church, institutions of Canada, and within her own community. She reveals the multi-layered dimensions of discourse that function to maintain the status quo of Indigenous women. McKay uses examples of her own experiences as case studies in order to examine the discourses which position particular bodies as inferior and how these positions operate and continue to place Indigenous women in the margins of society. So aside from the introduction, also this is this image here. Just highlighting this in green here where you can see it. This is not an image of Marlene E. McKay. That is probably one of the most famous feminists, and her name is Gloria Steinem. So aside from its introduction, conclusion, and references, the book contains 12 sections or chapters. Most of the titles are quite elaborate and indicate exactly what each chapter is going to discuss or consider. Like, for example, she has childhood memories and learned positioning, or Indigenous male dominance at work. So her titles are quite enlightening. So in each chapter, she works towards examining positions of power. But don't forget that this book is also a memoir. So in this way, it is quite unique. So she's asking us to consider experiences that she's recalled, as well as the way she is analyzing these experiences and trying to understand the places of women and color or race, and how that these positions, these places of these bodies are marginalized. So in many ways, the book overlaps. For example, we as readers are returned to similar themes over and over, as if McKay is still struggling to make sense of her own beginnings and her early life, or her life perhaps in general, and how it's created the person she is. So as you're reading, she keeps returning to similar episodes, themes, concepts, ideas, struggles. She discusses her work ethic in more than one section, and how hard she's had to work as a child within her home environment, but also outside of it. So she also talks about the work she did as a young adult in Stella's Cafe. And she also talks, of course, about the work involved in her education and the work she embarked upon as an adult, and its many difficulties. So she discusses, and I just kind of broke down some of the major discussions: parents, grandparents, family, the Catholic Church, education, work history, marriage, and interactions with an in-law. So you can, of course, pause this and read this through. I'm not going to read it out for you, but just I think it helps just to kind of put it kind of in order in our mind. So as far as discussions on the book, what I've done is I've pulled some quotations out of it. I do want to mention that she does write about her early life and how she lived without plumbing and running water until the late 1970s, which is quite shocking that someone is living into like 1977 or 78 without plumbing, running water, and that her family was reliant upon wood for heat, and they were hauling water. So even once they did have plumbing, they didn't have drinkable water, so they were still hauling drinkable water from a well into their home. So she also talks about learning to do laundry on an old wringer washer. I've given you an image of that here, as well as hanging clothes to dry, even in winter. So there's also, we'll notice there's a dichotomy, kind of a, I don't know, a back and forth in the early chapters, where McKay says that she has fond memories of childhood and feels loved, yet also feels, and this is a returning word, insignificant, overworked, and as if her failure is an accepted aspect of who she is, even as a child. There's also, and that we see that quote on page 29 where she writes, "My failure was predetermined, and people were expecting that I fall into the nothingness that I was." She also has a moment on pages 16 and 17 where she talks about how she learned that the phrase broken English maybe should be questioned, and that the way she speaks English is not broken, but is accented because it is not her native tongue. So I've put in two quotes. One of the quotes I put in is, "I believe I came to knowing about marginal spaces from the way people in my community and family organized each other." And what she's discussing here is how she felt, and she writes at one point that she feels that she was an unwanted child in her family, and not being wanted is, she indicates to us, it's because she was born outside of wedlock. She talks about how the two older children from her that her mother had as a married woman were treated differently and better than her. And so she's noticing that she is being organized, or is being slotted into a different kind of space or position than her older siblings. And she also, at one point, right around page 24, she's talking about attractiveness. And she writes, "For those who come from racialized communities, whiteness and cuteness may have its benefits." She also goes on indicating that that being attractive may have not have as many benefits as people may think, but that's, and I'm not sure if you agree with that or not, but that's what she indicates. She writes that that in her communities, if you were her older siblings pass for white, they are described as white-skinned, fair-eyed, and fair-haired, and that this ability to pass as white in her community is to be treated better. This is, I've given you this, I just found this on the internet. The source is there for you. And it's just one of many examples of beauty and a labor market. And you'll see attractive people are hired, often more, particularly women, and their wage is affected by their appearance. She also, and I find this a little bit comical. I think it's something almost every generation does. Every generation is always complaining about the generation coming up as being not very hardworking. And she certainly does this as well. She talks about how hard she works, and then we'll talk about how, millennials are, prone to their technological devices. She also defines discourse, and this is really, I think, kind of the heart of her book. From the book, she writes, discourses are many and they come from different places. Discourses in what is said and done. Discourses are social practices and they are in institutions. Discourses are about ways of doing things that are known and acceptable. Depending on what an individual is doing, discourses work to praise or punish people. So her definition is a bit different than any other I've come across, but I recognize what she means by it. Common discourse is a term regarding generic interpersonal communication. So, for example, chatting about the weather is an example of common discourse. And the rules regarding just common discourse or that type of communication is, of course, dependent upon culture to some extent, but easily grasped by most adults. Formal discourse has greater rules surrounding it, and is normally that discourse at work, or in kind of business settings, like if you're going to a lawyer to get your will drawn up, if you work in an office building, even if you work at Starbucks, they have a discourse, a way of talking, a way of being at work. So, and often you'll even see that in jargon. So there's specialized terminology. If you're in the business world, like maybe profits, margins, dividends, etc. Obviously, that type of discourse, with its specialized terminology, being in a work, it poses greater rules because, of course, it's also associated with etiquette. So, for example, you're not going to speak to your boss or the CEO of a company that you work for the same as you're going to speak to your friends. Academic discourse involves textbook presentations, dissertations, research, articles, and lectures. So after she kind of gives us her definition of discourse, she provides us lists of discourses associated with, for example, the church, with being Indigenous, and discourses associated with the Canadian Indian Act. From the book, she writes, Foucault's 1995 idea of panopticon becomes evident here. And here she's meaning the operation of discourses, because when people are in a circle, everyone can see each other, which is not exactly what's happening with panopticon, but in any event. So she has an idea of what she is discussing, but she isn't all that clear what she means in the text. So it seems like she's under the impression that most of us are going to be familiar with the work of Foucault and the theory of panopticon and where Foucault intersected this theory, but I'm imagining most of us are not that familiar with it. So here's just some information on Michel Foucault. He was a French philosopher born in 1926. He passed away in 1984. And this, a lot of this I've taken from the Stanford biographical sketch on him, where they write that he was a brilliant but psychologically tormented student. He became academically established during the 60s. And in 69, he received an ultra prestigious position with the college in France, and he was a professor of the history of systems of thought until his death. He was active from the 1970s on, a founder of this group, and often protested on behalf of marginalized groups. He also lectured outside of France in the United States, and in '83 had agreed to teach annually at the University of California at Berkeley. Of course, he did not, because he was an early victim of AIDS, and he died in 1984. Then also from Stanford, biographical sketch. One might question whether Foucault is in fact a philosopher. His academic formation was in psychology and its history, as well as in philosophy. His books were mostly histories of medical and social sciences. His passions were literary and political. Nonetheless, almost all of Foucault's works can be fruitfully read as philosophical in either or both of two ways: as carrying out philosophy's traditional critical project in a new historical manner, and as a critical engagement with the thought of traditional philosophers. So, and then they go on to say that this article will present him as a philosopher. When most academics are talking about him, they do refer to him as a philosopher. He was an outspoken critic of the panopticon. So the panopticon is a disciplinary concept, and it was brought to life in the form of a central observation tower placed within a circle of prison cells. So from the tower, a guard can see every cell and inmate, but the inmates can't see into the tower. So prisoners will never know whether or not they're being watched by the guards. And this was introduced into, like, the concept, and this architecture was introduced by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And it was a manifestation of his belief that power should be visible and unverifiable. So through this seemingly constant surveillance, Bentham believed all groups of society could be altered. So he believed that if we were always watched, our morals would be reformed, health would be preserved, industry would be invigorated, and so on. So this idea of being observed is somehow going to bring out the best in every individual. So Foucault was a critic of the panopticon. He argued that the panopticon's ultimate goal is to induce in the inmates, because remember, it was designed initially as a prison. It would induce in the inmates a state of conscious visibility. This assures the automatic functioning of power. To him, this form of incarceration is and I'm quoting him, cruel, ingenious cage. He also compares this disciplinary observation to a medieval village under quarantine, which I imagine has a lot of resonance right now for us because of the pandemic that we are living through. So I'm sure that resonates for most of us. This idea of being, having to wear facial masks, hand sanitizing, having to stand 2 meters away from one another, having like these ideas of bubbles of who we're actually talking to and visiting, are able to visit and talk to. So in many ways, we are quarantined. So he compares this disciplinary observation to a medieval village under quarantine. In order to stamp out the plague, officials must strictly separate everyone and control the streets to ensure villagers don't leave their homes and become sick. If villagers are caught outside, this is obviously in the medieval age, the punishment is death. So, and this is, I just found this on the internet, and it's a quote from his Discipline and Punish. I think that's one of his most well-known books from '77, where he writes, "The panopticon must be understood as a dream building. It is the diagram of a mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form." And he's not being flattering. He really just likes it. So this idea of this village under constant surveillance, or the idea of constant surveillance, creates regulation in even the smallest details of everyday life. Foucault calls this a discipline blockade, an exceptional enclosed space on the edge of society. So if we think about panopticism today, we're likely to think of it in terms of new technologies than in prison towers. Like, for example, we might think of it as surveillance capitalism, and how every site we visit and what we're looking at online is being logged and being watched and monitored, and our data is being, used. So that's definitely like this surveillance of capitalism, how to get us to spend our money by watching how we're spending our money, watching how we're interested in certain things, and every advertisement is geared towards us, what we are looking at. Also, you might think of it as our personal computers perform a role as information panopticons, which monitor, for example, the amount of work being completed by an individual. So many employers through the pandemic have put programs on work computers that their employees are taking home that track keystrokes, so that they can ascertain their employees' hours. So these are examples of monitoring and data collection. But as you are well aware, there are many, many more. So McKay sees these ideas of control that are used within discourse, and she sees how discourse is confining and controlling. She writes, from the book, each individual measures, compares, and organizes one another using discourses. Individuals communicate verbally or non-verbally in a way that demonstrates judgment. Foucault's notion of relations of power emerge in the operation of discourse. The relations of power function to keep people in line with what is expected of them through the discourses. We are confined by discourse. She also writes later on in the book on page 81, discourses operate to produce bodies in particular ways. So again, she's looking at discourse in all its different ways and how it controls and confines. Toward the end of the book, she writes, and this is a quote that she is quoting, critical scholars define racism as a systemic relationship of unequal power between white people and people of color. Whiteness refers to the specific dimensions of racism that elevate white people over people of color. Basic rights, resources, and experiences that are assumed to be shared by all are actually only available to whites. Although many whites feel that being white has no meaning, this feeling is unique to white people and is a key part of what it means to be white. To see one's race as having no meaning is a privilege only whites are afforded. To claim to be just human and thus outside of race is one of the most powerful and pervasive manifestations of whiteness. So her final example or case study is how she's treated by her, and I'm quoting, white ex-in-law. So McKay writes that she possesses double consciousness. Some Indigenous peoples and scholars have referred to this as code switching or two-eyed seeing, which an Ojibwe elder came up with the term two-eyed seeing. These, double consciousness, two-eyed seeing, code switching refers to being able to navigate fluidly between the dominant culture and our own. So I navigate fluidly through the dominant white culture in Canada, as well as I can switch over to the Métis, my Métis culture, very easily. So thus McKay discusses, and I quote, participating in that drama, and she's meaning her mistreatment by her ex-in-law. So it's really interesting to me how she sees this code switching as participating in this drama And she doesn't seem to know how to extricate herself from it, like how to, this woman is patting her head and wagging her finger in her face. I'm not sure if this is like code switching. On one hand, she's saying that she can see what the white person's doing. I would not use this as code switching or double consciousness. I believe that her in-law was rude and mistreating her and condescending. But I'm going to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what McKay means in that instance, or what she's fully trying to talk about, other than the fact that that woman made her feel defensive and kind of coddled in a weird kind of head patting motion. That's a weird thing to do to a person. So that is the end of Forbidden Fruit. It's not I know that it's not a beautifully written book, but Marlene E. McKay is not a creative writer. She is an academic. So that's part of it. But it still really has so many merits to it, and it has so much here to learn from and to consider and examine. And I know she's kind of tends to be she tends to make a lot of lists, but I actually think they're really helpful. And as far as a memoir goes, I think what I really, really love about this book is that she doesn't think, like, it's not like, oh, here's a journey and a nice little basket with a bow on it. Instead, she's really describing the difficulties and the challenges that she faced as an Indigenous woman in northern Saskatchewan. And these challenges of race, color, of her language barriers, of really feeling that she was destined to be nothing, that she was not wanted, that she wasn't considered, that she was unloved. And that despite all of that, she attained so much. And so in that way, I think it's just an absolutely wonderful text. Okay, thank you very much, and be well. Our next book we begin next week is A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. And so I will see you next week. Bye.